Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephen Shrybman. I'm a lawyer. I practice at Sackle Blatt Mitchell. I've been practicing law for the past 30 years doing environmental and public interest work. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you tomorrow. We're taping this on Friday afternoon, but very pleased that you have gathered because you're concerned about the extraction of shale gas through various fracking processes and what that's doing to the environment. I, at the moment, am in the midst of representing the Council of Canadians at a proceeding before the Ontario Energy Board. And that proceeding arises from applications brought by Enbridge Gas Distribution Limited and Union Gas. And what the applications propose to do is to restructure the gas infrastructure, the natural gas infrastructure in and around the GTA. The companies say in part to deal with various technical and capacity problems on the system, but it's very clear, and the companies are, acknowledge this, that basically the natural gas system of North America is being transformed by the sudden availability of very large quantities of gas that are being extracted from shale plays in the United States. And that has, in a way, turned the continent upside down in terms of the energy economy of the continent and the basic pipeline infrastructure that exists to move oil and gas resources, oil resources as well, to consumers. For those of us who've been waiting for some great technological innovation to address the problems of climate change, it's, with considerable dismay that we realize that the innovation's taken place, or the innovation that has taken place in the energy sector simply is about extracting more and more fossil fuels from the planet for us to consume, and that innovation is, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And as many of you will know, the train that exploded in Lac Mégantic was carrying oil from the Bakken, which is a shale play, by rail, because the pipeline infrastructure didn't anticipate a huge flow of oil from that part of North America. And the same thing is happening in the natural gas sector. And so because one of the largest shale plays is the Marcellus, which, as you know, is very close to us in northern United States, and I think it actually underlies part of Quebec. There's an awful lot of gas that's suddenly become available. It's not cheaper than gas from conventional sources out west, but it's a lot closer, so the tolls required in order to move it from the source to markets in Ontario and also Quebec are much lower, and so there's been a great rush to access that frack gas flow. The councils intervened in this proceeding to raise various issues concerning the source of the natural gas that will be flowing through this pipeline infrastructure in the GTA, the source being the Marcellus and perhaps eventually the Utica shale plays. We've raised 4 basic concerns about the plans by Enbridge and Union Gas. The first has to do with our assessment that indeed there may not be this great bonanza of frack gas in the northeastern United States after all. And we've called an expert. His name is John Hughes. He's a Canadian, and he's done a lot of analysis of not the grand projections of how much shale gas there will be, but rather what the record of shale gas extraction actually has been. And that record shows that in their very initial years, and of the 5 major shale plays in the United States, 4 of them are less than 5 years old. There's this very quick ramp up in terms of production, but it quickly falls off at around year 4 or 5 because, as Mr. Hughes' analysis reveals, there are sweet spots in these shale plays. Not all of these enormous shale plays produce at the same level. So there may well not be the kind of volumes that the companies are projecting to be in the shale play. The related issue we've raised is that, well, even if the volumes are there, they're not going to be nearly as cheap as the companies claim. And that's because there is an enormous gap between the environmental impacts associated with shale gas extraction, and you will have just watched Gasland 2, so you'll have a good sense of what some of those impacts are in terms of groundwater impacts, in terms of public health impacts, in terms of waste management impacts, and I'll come in a moment to greenhouse gas emissions. But there is a huge gap between reality and regulation, and and many communities in the United States are pressing governments to close that gap. When that happens, much of the gas extracted from the shale play, if indeed companies are still permitted to do that, and you know that there are moratoria in place in the United States, in New York, I believe, and in Quebec. I think Newfoundland has just proclaimed a moratorium because some jurisdictions are persuaded that it's just too dangerous, and the environmental impacts and public health impacts associated with fracking are too severe to countenance any level of extraction. But where extraction is still allowed, the costs are going to go up because companies are going to have to take measures to protect groundwater, to manage waste properly, to protect the community's health, and that's going to add significantly to the cost of shale gas. So projections about it being abundant are questionable, and questions about it being cheap are surely questionable. Another reason that we've intervened in this process, an issue we have raised, is that by moving the GTA in Ontario and even Quebec, because this restructuring of the gas infrastructure in the GTA is for the purposes of serving all of Eastern Ontario and Quebec as well. By moving all that demand off the mainline pipe, which is the principal source whereby this part of Canada accesses natural gas, and that is from conventional sources from Western Canada, we're leaving the Trans-Canada mainline pipe without enough customers to stay in business, and Trans-Canada Pipeline, TCPL, has said as much. Now, it is working out a deal with Union Gas and with Enbridge and others to kind of stay afloat for the next few years, but the very future of that gas infrastructure is at issue. And as many of you will know, given the, basically the flight of customers, of natural gas customers, for the product that the TCPL pipeline used to deliver to this area, TCPL has a new and bright idea, and that bright idea is to convert the pipeline to oil use, so it will become a major conduit for oil from the tar sands to Eastern Canada, to the Irving refinery out east, and to international markets. An extremely problematic endeavor. It's called the Energy East Project, but it is a consequence of the flight to frack gas by customers that typically took their gas from the pipeline. It's also in part a reflection of the fact that conventional natural gas resources are declining, which only underscores the importance of using them wisely. And right now, far too much of that resource is being dedicated to in situ extraction of bitumen in the tar sands, another problematic dimension of the energy dynamics we confront. The last reason, and arguably the most important reason, that we've intervened in this process and have ultimately decided to oppose the projects is what we are learning about the greenhouse gas footprint of frack gas. And I've seen Gasland too, and I recall Anthony Ingraffia, Dr. Anthony Ingraffia is professor at Cornell University, being in the film. And he was also generous enough to volunteer his time to be an expert for us in this proceeding before the Ontario Energy Board. And so he came to Toronto along with David Hughes and Lisa Sumi, who is a US consultant and environmentalist, who talked about the failure of regulatory regimes to adequately address fracking. But Anthony came as well, and he gave evidence of the various of the work that he's done with his colleagues to try to get a handle on the greenhouse gas intensity of fracking. Now, most of you will know, and as I recall, Anthony described this in the film, that methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, many tens of times as potent as carbon dioxide, at least as measured over a 20-year time horizon. And we know that the next 20 years is absolutely critical in terms of dealing with the unbelievably pressing problem of climate change. Very, very high levels of greenhouse gas impacts when methane, which is natural gas, escapes to the atmosphere. Most people think natural gas is a clean fuel. Why? Because when it burns quite efficiently. So the volume of carbon dioxide emissions from natural gas combustion are much lower than they are from coal, where there's a ton of CO2 and a lot of particulate, which is itself a major public health problem, or oil. But when you look at the budget of greenhouse gas impact as it's associated with fracking, Mr. Ingraffia's work, Professor Ingraffia's work, indicates that it's more serious than coal and oil because of the volume of methane that escapes during the fracking process. And you'll see, there are lots of examples of this, of course, in Gasline 1 and Gasline 2, because you see people kind of lighting their pipes, lighting their taps on fire, which is an indication of just how much natural gas is escaping from the well. But even where there's not enough to combust, there's an awful lot that's escaping to the atmosphere, uncombusted. And it's that creates the largest part of the greenhouse gas burden associated with this natural gas from this source. There are others. Natural gas escapes from pipelines, it escapes from infrastructure. I've had people in the unions that represent the workers that work on the national gas infrastructure in Toronto tell me that there are places where the pipes are broken, where they're corroded, where basically natural gas is flowing through a hole in the earth rather than a pipeline. And Professor Ingraffia kind of provided another perspective on that for me by saying that if you flew over Toronto, you'd have no difficulty measuring methane releases just in the atmosphere over the city. So we've got a very big problem, and it looks like in fact, all of the evidence points to the fact that fracking is going to just very seriously exacerbate the climate change problem we have, which is why Professor Ingraffia, I think, has coined the term welcome to the gang, well, I think that's my phrase, welcome to the gangplank, ladies and gentlemen. But what he said is that natural gas isn't the bridge fuel that most people present it to be, particularly when the source of that gas is shale. What it is a gangplank and not a bridge at all. Finally, what we have to say to the Ontario Energy Board, and we have lots of company here, that we're alone in looking at the upstream source of the natural gas that's going to be flowing through the system and serving people in the GTA. Let me add parenthetically that we've done some number crunching to try to figure out how much energy this is in terms I'm more familiar with, which is barrels of oil. But the amount of gas that's supposed to flow into the GTA, just to serve the GTA, so this isn't the stuff that's going to Quebec or Eastern Ontario, is the equivalent of 44 million barrels of oil a year, according to our calculations. So it's an awful lot. But the last point we make, of course, is that we don't need more growth in terms of natural gas consumption, and in fact can't endure it. And there are ways in which we can curtail not only growth, but also reduce our consumption of natural gas and begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as we're obligated to morally and as we're committed to as a matter of provincial policy. And that's energy efficiency and conservation and demand measures. And the companies promoting this infrastructure restructuring have done little to nothing to even consider the role that efficiency and demand management could play in dealing with the problems they say are the reason they have to spend over $1 billion on the gas infrastructure in the GTA. And what Professor Ingraffia has to say about all of that is simply that, look, this stuff isn't a bridge, it's a gangplank. There's no sense putting off what we know ultimately needs to be done, which is to reduce our energy consumption and greenhouse gas footprint. We know how to do that now, so rather than spending $1 billion or any money on facilitating yet further consumption of fossil fuels, we need to commit that money and more to reducing our use of energy and our greenhouse gas footprint on this planet. Very happy to have had this chance to chat with you. I only wish I could be there. Very happy that you're tuned into this issue and paying attention to the enormous problems that fracking presents.